Tonight, Canada throws a tariff counterpunch at the United States. Going toe-to-toe with dollar-for-dollar tariffs while urging Donald Trump to back down.
Canada's absolutely one of the worst.
We will do what we must do to protect Canada's economy.
Awaiting a high-stakes meeting as Mark Carney gets ready to take the reins. Plus, what landed on the long list of products that could soon cost you more.
This is going to be overnight a net increase in costs.
What a rate cut in the thick of a financial feud means for prices and pocketbooks, and the bitter cold reality in the Arctic and the skills Canadian soldiers need for survival. Plus, caught in the middle of a trade war.
If the retaliatory action kills our water and power, we're done.
A small border community fears for its fate while trying to make its friendship with Canada stick.
CTV National News with Omar Sachedina. Reporting tonight, Heather Wright.
Good evening. We now know when Liberal leader Mark Carney will officially become Canada's 24th Prime Minister. CTV News has learned he will be sworn in on Friday and is finalizing a cabinet that will be smaller and focused on the trade war with the United States. In the meantime, the current Liberal government is hitting back against Donald Trump's tariffs on aluminum and steel that went into effect today, announcing billions of dollars worth of counter tariffs set to kick in tomorrow as crucial talks begin in Washington. CTV's Mike LeCouture starts us off.
It is going to be maximum pressure and efficient diplomacy.
The pressure comes in the form of $29.8 billion worth of tariffs on American products. The diplomacy will be in meetings with U.S. officials tomorrow in D.C. and Charlevoix, Quebec.
These continued tariff measures and the necessary and appropriate response that comes from Canada is not a constructive path to be on. If you're like racing to the basement, there's no real prize for being the first person to get to the basement.
LeBlanc spoke with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick today and will be one of several Canadian politicians meeting him tomorrow, hoping to remove all tariffs in advance of the April 2nd deadline. The meeting was offered after Lutnick reached out to Ontario's Premier yesterday. Now, it came after Doug Ford imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity going to the U.S.
We're going to lower the temperature. You know, he thought he'd be sort of the big man and tackle Donald Trump, but you know you can't tackle Donald Trump.
After talking to Lutnick yesterday, Ford walked back that threat and will be part of those meetings in Washington.
Let's stop this. It's going to hurt both economies. It's American people that are going to get hurt. Canadians are going to get hurt.
But President Donald Trump continues to see it as a one-way problem.
Canada's absolutely one of the worst. And we, when I say worst in terms of charging tariffs.
In a show of support for workers, Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney visited a steel plant in Hamilton. He's promised proceeds from Canadian tariffs on American goods will go to people in the affected industries. Carney is also committing to heading to the White House.
I'm ready to sit down with President Trump at the appropriate time under a position where there's respect for Canadian sovereignty, and we're working for a common approach, a much more comprehensive approach for trade.
Carney will become the 24th Prime Minister of this country after he's sworn in on Friday. And CTV News has learned his cabinet will be substantially smaller than the current one, which has 37 ministers. Heather?
All right, Mike, thank you. Nuts, bolts, tricycles, and umbrellas. The list of American products set to go up in price tomorrow because of retaliatory tariffs includes many household staples. CTV's Geneviève Beauchemin has those details.
Canada's counterpunch lands on a wide range of U.S. goods, and yes, it's likely it will end up hurting your wallet.
Now, the list includes products like umbrellas, the kinds for rain and sun, some tableware made of china or porcelain. There's also nuts and bolts and tools like handsaws. Luminaires, but also a variety of sports equipment and tricycles are on the list too.
For small businesses that make up the vast majority of enterprises in Canada, that could be painful.
It's inputs that are going to be more expensive overnight. Some of them, again, we're able to build up some kind of inventory but inventories do not last forever.
And those businesses will likely pass off at least a chunk of that on to consumers. Overall, Canada's bill for the Americans, 25% on steel products worth $12.6 billion, 25% on aluminum products, $3 billion, and tariffs on another $14.2 billion worth of imported U.S. goods. And that list could get much longer. Canada plans to take off another $125 billion worth of U.S. goods if the Americans impose more tariffs next month. Geneviève Beauchemin, CTV News, Montreal.
The Bank of Canada is warning of a new crisis as it announced another interest rate cut. While economic uncertainty caused by the trade war was a key reason for today's decision, Governor Tiff Macklem warned monetary policy can only do so much. CTV's Judy Trin explains.
With its latest interest rate cut, the Bank of Canada warns the trade war launched by the United States will push Canadians into troubling territory.
We are now facing a new crisis. Depending on the extent and duration of new U.S. tariffs, the economic impact could be severe.
The central bank is trying to keep inflation down by announcing an interest rate cut of 25 basis points to 2.75%. That's the 7th consecutive drop in a year. The cuts are meant to encourage spending, but costs are expected to rise with tariffs as supplies that Canadian companies need from the U.S. will become more expensive.
A trade war is a supply shock. It's going to disrupt supply chains. It's going to affect production costs and production capacities.
Last month, the bank surveyed hundreds of Canadians. It found that many companies had lowered their sales projections and were considering layoffs. Nearly half of the businesses planned to increase their prices, while customers were planning to spend less. Workers in mining, manufacturing, and the oil and gas industry felt most vulnerable.
Monetary policy cannot offset the impacts of a trade war. We're going to get weaker economic activity. We're going to get higher prices, higher inflation.
Unless the U.S. drops or limits its protectionist measures, economic growth could stagnate.
A 1% shock to GDP would pretty much put us in a crawling position and thus a recession. So it's definitely we're waiting to see how the economic data comes in.
In this trade war, the Bank of Canada is implying that the bulk of responsibility for controlling inflation will rest with the country's politicians on what taxes they decide to cut and where they decide to spend. Heather.
Judy, thank you. U.S. stock indexes rose slightly today, with some relief coming from encouraging inflation numbers, though experts warn that could be short-lived once the tariff impact kicks in. Trump is also facing backlash from Europe as his global steel and aluminum tariffs took effect. CTV's Washington Bureau Chief Joy Malbon has the reaction.
For any leader meeting Donald Trump, it's always a delicate diplomatic dance when trade and tariffs are on the president's mind.
Ireland was very smart. They took our pharmaceutical companies away from
Donald Trump not sparing anyone, including Canada and the European Union, after he slapped a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the U.S. The EU struck back, slapping a tax on $28 billion of American goods, from blue jeans, bourbon to motorcycles, ramping up a global trade war Trump insists is necessary.
We have a problem with the European Union. They don't take our farm products, they don't take our cars. If they charge us 25 or 20% or 10% or 2% or 200%, then that's what we're charging them.
Threatening even more pain, as America's biggest bank, J.P. Morgan's chief economist warned there's about a 40% chance of a U.S. recession this year, which would rise to 50% if Trump follows through on reciprocal tariffs next month.
It's economic nonsense. It's going to leave everybody engaged in the trade war worse off and economically, and going to cause enormous damage.
Even after an encouraging inflation report, all this uncertainty has rattled markets, the president defending his on-again, off-again tariffs.
I have the right to adjust. And I was called by the automakers, and they asked me to do them a favor. Could I delay it? I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Even as Republicans demand more clarity on the president's strategy, Americans have soured on Trump's trade war. New polling shows more than half disapprove of his handling of the economy. Heather?
All right, Joy Malbon in Washington. G7 foreign ministers are gathering in Quebec for discussions ahead of the main summit in June in Alberta. The global trade war and Russia's war in Ukraine, both high on the agenda. CTV's Jeremy Charron is in Charlevoix, where Canada's sovereignty has also become a talking point. Jeremy.
Heather, the message from the U.S. Secretary of State is he won't be bringing up taking over our country. But Marco Rubio will be hard-pressed to avoid facing questions about what President Donald Trump has said about annexing Canada. Ahead of tomorrow's G7 Foreign Ministers Summit here in Charlevoix, where Rubio's attendance has quickly become a focal point, especially for Canada, the Secretary of State says he'll talk about shared interests and not annexing our country.
That's what the meeting is about. It is not a meeting about how we're going to take over Canada.
But he did reiterate Donald Trump's notion that Canada would be better off as a 51st state.
He says if they became the 51st state, we wouldn't have to worry about the border and fentanyl coming across because now we would be able to manage that. He's made an argument that it's their interest to do so. Obviously, the Canadians don't agree, apparently.
Canadian sovereignty and identity are non-negotiable. Canadians have had enough, and we are a strong country. We'll defend our sovereignty, we'll defend our jobs, and we'll defend our way of living.
Now, that could make for some tough talk here tomorrow morning when Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly hosts a bilateral meeting with Rubio, where I'm told tariffs and U.S.-Canada relations will be top of the agenda. As for the larger agenda here in Charlevoix, issues relating to the geopolitical landscape will be top priority, including the situation in the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine war. The U.S. Secretary of State is coming off a positive meeting with his Ukrainian counterparts. Heather?
All right, Jeremy Charron at the G7 in Charlevoix. Jeremy, thanks. Violent clashes erupted in Argentina's capital today between protesters and police that began out of a march over pensions. Police fired rubber bullets, used pepper spray and water cannons on demonstrators in Buenos Aires. The protest over pension cuts, medication, and retirement benefits boiled over as soccer fans joined the retirees in a show of solidarity over the high cost of living.
Air 2, they're doing the takedown now. Got a foot pursuit here, southbound through the residential area.
Toronto police have released dramatic aerial footage of a takedown connected to a violent carjacking. 3 teenagers were taken into custody for allegedly stealing a car at knife point on Saturday night.
It's a little alarming, you know, like I've never been on a flight before with officers, let alone like canines showing up.
A WestJet flight was canceled and police were called to Calgary Airport after a security threat this morning. Passengers were about to board a flight to Ottawa when a large number of police officers showed up and RCMP canine units began searching the aircraft. The RCMP is not commenting on the nature of the threat. 2 American astronauts stranded in space will have to wait longer to return home after the NASA SpaceX mission meant to bring them back was postponed after a hydraulic ground issue. And coming up, lessons on surviving in the frigid Arctic.
Things that are going to kill you out here. There's 3 of them. The ice, cold, and arrogance.
What it takes to protect and fortify Canada's north. Plus, tariffs are brewing chaos at a Canadian beer giant. For years, Canada's military has been dogged by a recruitment crisis. Right now, they're roughly short 16,000 troops. But in the last few months, numbers are suddenly up, and reservists are training in what may be a future front in a battle over sovereignty and natural resources, the Arctic. W5's John Woodward reports.
These soldiers are working together to haul their gear into a school in Inuvik, where they're preparing their kit.
Well, we have our mucklucks here.
These mucklucks worked well for Sergeant Chad Wiseman in the Newfoundland winters he's used to. Today is their first Arctic test.
What's the difference you've noticed so far being in this environment versus back home?
I think the temperatures, when you check the forecast, the temperatures seem a bit intimidating.
Private Matthew Bradley, just 18 years old, says getting here was a shock.
You breathe in and like your nose hairs are freezing like immediately. That was the biggest thing I noticed for sure.
That was the big warning for you. What have I gotten myself into?
Something like that for sure.
At their first briefing in the Arctic training exercise, Operation Nanook, another dose of cold reality.
This is not your backyard.
Many are reservists, part-time soldiers. This is their first contact with one of Canada's Arctic Rangers, military experts in the wilderness, known by their red hoodies.
Things that are going to kill you out here. There's 3 of them. The ice, the cold, and arrogance.
The troops will learn skills from those Rangers because to fight, you first have to survive. But as their tents go up, Corporal Katie King notices something unexpected about the cold.
It's a dry cold up here, which I'm used to a wet cold, so it hits you more back home.
The next morning, it's Private Bradley who feels more confident.
You got your thermals on in there as well. Like I just stripped down a little bit too. It's pretty hot.
You were too hot
Yeah.
in a canvas tent in the winter in Inuvik?
Yeah. I mean, they're made for it.
An encouraging sign for Operation Nanook. One reason it's hosting so many reservists, the Canadian military is running another large operation at the same time. 2,000 members are in Latvia as peacekeepers. Recruitment, which has typically lagged by thousands, is on its way to meet this year's recruiting goal of 6,500. Operation Nanook also includes reservists under the command of Captain Joshua Rumbold.
What we hope to see is the effects of our demolitions on those targets.
Whose demonstration requires us to wear safety gear.
Why am I wearing the helmet? Because we're about to see an enormous amount of C4 blow up.
His crew will deploy powerful explosives against this snow defense made of bricks of ice.
How much C4 is in there?
So we actually have 13 blocks of C4 in there.
The goal, to learn how C4 detonates in the cold.
As a precautionary measure, we've got to get 500 meters away from those blasts, but we'll leave some cameras rolling.
3, 2, 1.
And seconds later, a successful test that validates the prep work.
I was emotional, a little bit overcome with joy that this was able to happen.
As the reservists realize in the cold, they may be more prepared than they first thought.
Tomorrow, a world first, prepping a runway on a frozen lake and landing one of the world's largest planes. Well, a party supporting independence from Denmark has won an election in Greenland at a time when Donald Trump says he wants control of the Arctic island.
It's so important to represent the Greenlandic now, that we stand together, that we don't want to be a part of the States and we don't want to be under America.
Greenland opted for a complete overhaul of its government, with the center-right Democrat Party getting about 30% of the vote. The pro-business party is now expected to begin coalition talks. Still ahead, how tariffs are spilling over into a classic Canadian brewery. As Canada's oldest independent brewery, Moosehead has been through its share of challenges. 2 separate fires, the Halifax explosion, and now a trade war with the United States, which will impact not only the beer it sells, but the cans it comes in. CTV's Sarah Plowman reports.
New tariffs are brewing more uncertainty, putting more pain on tap for Moosehead.
Right now, I would just describe the situation as chaos. I hope we can just get back to calm.
The 25% tariff on aluminum is going to hurt.
This is made in Canada. The 473 is currently made in the United States.
Even the Canada-made cans end up crossing the border, adding to costs. Olin says raw aluminum from Quebec is shipped to the U.S. to make aluminum rolls. That's sent back to Canada to make cans. These lids all come from the U.S.
We're still working out, the financial impact. It seems to change by the day, if not by the hour.
20% of Moosehead's beer is sold to Americans. Beer, hops, and cartons are all vulnerable to potential tariffs. To fight back, the company created the Presidential Pack with 1,461 beers.
One for each day between now and the end of the presidency, including the leap year in 2028.
The crate costs nearly $3,500 and it's currently sold out.
We originally had a maximum of 5, but we took it to 10, and the waiting list is over 100.
The Presidential Pack is only available in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Ontario. Olin says that's because of interprovincial trade barriers, which he hopes will come down soon, but he's skeptical about that. Sarah Plowman, CTV News, St. John.
Still ahead, how a struggling border town stuck in the middle of a trade war is sticking by Canada's side. Well, Canadians and Americans alike are beginning to feel the strain of this trade war. Those who live in the many exclaves along the border have seen life change overnight. One town is Point Roberts in Washington state, which can only be reached on land by going through BC. CTV's Craig Krause reports.
Scenes out of an apocalyptic movie taking place in the small American border town of Point Roberts, Washington.
I'm running out of things to clean, running out of little side projects to keep everybody gainfully employed.
International Marketplace, once home to Canadians looking for cheap cheese or American snacks, have vanished, down more than 20% year over year, leaving 18 employees, including Dave Duncan, the store's manager, on the verge of unemployment.
It's a fine balance keeping stuff on the shelves and not having too much that we have to, oh crap, we're going to throw this away now because we didn't get the customer flow that we needed.
Just around the corner, dual citizen Tamara Hansen has operated the Saltwater Cafe for 9 years, but says it's no longer sustainable.
Just did my numbers for February and I'm down 55%.
Hansen calling on Olympia, the state capital, to step in as the fate of the community is in jeopardy.
We can't afford any lip service here. We need action.
A meeting between the Chamber of Commerce and the state is scheduled this week. But in the meantime,
I want to thank Brian Calder for actually coming up with this idea.
Slapped on bumpers and doors intended to send a message as Ottawa and Washington joust.
We're so interdependent with Canada, particularly British Columbia, and more importantly, Metro Vancouver, who supplies all our water. We pay for it, and we're happy to do that. If the retaliatory action kills our water and power, we're done.
A tense time as threats from both sides continue, leaving the community watching on with an uncertain future.
This must be stressful.
It is, but you try to look at the bright side of everything and be as kind as you can to everybody.
Craig Crow, CTV News, Point Roberts.
Now, there is a good reason why I am sitting in this chair tonight instead of Omar, as he and his wife Aisha have welcomed a daughter into the world. Meet Ayla Noor Sachedina, who was born earlier this week. Omar says mom and baby are both doing well. A huge congratulations to them all. For all of us at CTV National News, thank you for watching tonight. Good night, and we'll see you tomorrow.